Hi, welcome to our channel where we share the most intriguing stories. He thought he was buying peace and quiet, a forgotten lake with no strings attached, but beneath the calm waters hid a battle for power, lies, and millions in untapped resources. One man, one deed, and a fight against an entire HOA, hell-bent on stealing it all. I bought the lake the way most people buy trouble without realizing it. Quietly, on paper, and with the naive optimism of someone who believes documents still mean something. The auction itself was almost anticlimactic. A closed federal surplus sale, barely advertised, the kind of thing that only shows up if you know which government bulletin boards to read. 26 acres of water and shoreline in Taney County, Missouri. Former private fishing grounds, long abandoned, sold off after years of bureaucratic limbo. I read the listing 3 times before I believed it was real. Water rights included, shoreline included, no easements listed, no homeowners association mentioned anywhere. That last part mattered more than I was willing to admit. I won the auction without drama, no bidding war, no last-second jump. A clean transfer through the General Services Administration, a stack of paperwork thick enough to kill a small animal, and a deed that spelled it out in language so dry it felt unassailable. The lake was mine. Every inch of water, every muddy foot of shoreline. I signed, paid, and told myself that after years of working contracts for other people's water problems, I had finally bought something that didn't argue back. The house came with it. An old fisherman's place on the northern shore, weathered wood, a slanted dock that hadn't seen a boat in years, and cattails so thick along the bank they looked like they were trying to reclaim the land by force. I moved in with 2 trucks, a rented trailer, and exactly 0 expectations of neighbors. For the first couple of weeks, it was exactly what I'd hoped for. Mornings with fog hanging low over the water, evenings where the only sound was insects and the occasional splash of something alive and unconcerned with property lines. I cleared brush, repaired the old dock, took water samples out of habit more than necessity. The lake was healthy. Better than I'd expected. Clean inflow, stable levels, no obvious contamination. It felt like a gift. That illusion cracked on a Tuesday. I noticed the pier while walking the southwest edge, a stretch I hadn't fully cleared yet. At first, I thought I was disoriented. A wooden structure jutted out into the water where there hadn't been one before. New lumber, pressure-treated, straight lines. Someone had built a dock on my lake. Not near it, not adjacent to it. On it. A clean rectangle of planks with a sign bolted to the front that read, in neat block letters, Property of Lake's Edge, HOA. There were kayaks pulled up on the shore, plastic chairs stacked nearby, beer cans already, because of course there were. I stood there longer than I care to admit, trying to decide if this was a prank or the most confident act of trespassing I had ever seen. Then I pulled out my phone. Photos first, wide shots, close-ups. The sign, the construction bolts, the GPS coordinates. Every habit I'd picked up working government contracts kicked in automatically. I documented everything before anger had a chance to get creative. Lake's Edge was a development I'd noticed but ignored. A neat row of houses beyond the southern tree line, built years after the lake had been parceled off from the surrounding farmland. I had never set foot there, never attended a meeting, never signed anything with the letters H, O, or A anywhere near it. Still, here they were, building on my shoreline like they'd misplaced it on a map and decided possession was close enough to ownership. I sent a formal notice that afternoon. Certified mail, polite language, clear boundaries. I attached copies of the deed, the survey, and a request for immediate removal of the unauthorized structure. I expected confusion, maybe embarrassment. At worst, a bluff. What I got instead was a reply that arrived 2 days later, dripping with confidence. They called me an imposter, claimed the lake had historically functioned as a shared recreational resource, suggested I was exploiting a clerical error to privatize something that belonged to the community in spirit, if not in outdated paperwork. They closed by informing me that the pier would remain until rightful access was restored. I reread the letter twice, then once more out loud, just to make sure it sounded as insane as it felt. Somewhere between the word spirit and outdated, I realized this wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a declaration. Someone had decided the lake suited them better than it suited me, and they were betting I wouldn't push back hard enough to matter. I walked down to the water that evening and looked at the pier again. The sun was low, turning the surface gold, and the dock cast a long shadow across water I now understood was about to become contested. I remember thinking, not for the first time in my career, that water attracts two kinds of people: those who study it and those who think it belongs to whoever shouts the loudest. I didn't expect them to roll over. I'm not stupid. I've seen enough small-town politics to know that people in power rarely step away from a fight, even when they're wrong. What I didn't expect was just how fast they'd go on the offensive, and how dirty they'd be willing to play. About a week after I sent my cease and desist notice, the real campaign began. First came the newsletter, a glossy 8-page thing that Lakes Edge HOA sent out to all its residents. A neighbor slid a copy under my door without a word. The cover had a photo of the pier, my shoreline, framed like a brochure for a summer camp. The headline read, "Preserving Our Community's Heritage, a Return to Shared Waters." Inside, there was a full-page spread accusing me, by name, of land encroachment through administrative exploitation. They included a scanned image of what looked like an old county plat map from the 1970s, where the lake was marked in faint ink as recreation area, public use. No context, no legend, just a blurry historical document passed off as gospel truth. The write-up described me as a government contractor with unknown foreign ties, which was equal parts hilarious and defamatory. It painted the picture of an outsider who had used federal loopholes to seize what had always belonged to the people. There were pull quotes, one-liners from residents complaining they hadn't been able to fish or kayak without permission from some stranger in a pickup truck. They even included a QR code to a petition titled "Reclaim the Lake." It would have been laughable if it didn't start showing up everywhere, on corkboards at gas stations, shared on Facebook, by people I hadn't even met. The tone shifted. The stares got colder at the feed store. Someone spray-painted "thief" in red across my mailbox. A local op-ed ran in the Taney County Bulletin with a headline that read, "Privatizing Paradise. When one man locks the gate." I did what I always do when things stop making sense. I got organized. I put together every document from the sale: the deed, the federal transfer forms, the water rights declaration, correspondence with the GSA, even the original auction notice. Then I hired a private attorney who specialized in property disputes and a land surveyor who had no ties to the county. I didn't want even the shadow of conflict of interest. That's when things escalated again. My attorney received a civil summons. Lakes Edge HOA had filed a suit in county court alleging that I had obtained the land under false pretenses, claiming there was a cadastral error that mistakenly recorded the lake as private when it had always been designated for public access. The suit demanded the immediate invalidation of my deed, restoration of community access, and, this part made me laugh out loud, compensation for emotional damages caused to HOA residents by the loss of recreational tranquility. And just when I thought it couldn't get any more absurd, I got a phone call. No caller ID, a man's voice, smooth and casual. "Mr. Albury, I represent Lakes Edge HOA. I wanted to reach out informally as a courtesy." "Courtesy?" I repeated. "No one wants this to get uglier than it has to. These things can spiral. Lawsuits get expensive, records get re-examined, financing gets complicated. If I were you, I'd consider letting the HOA maintain limited access to the shoreline, maybe even formalize it. Everyone wins. You keep the house, they keep the pier, and nobody asks too many questions about how federal land gets sold off these days." There was a long pause. I could hear the hum of fluorescent lights on his end. A cheap office. Maybe a law firm, maybe not. "I'm hanging up now," I said. "No problem," he replied, like we were discussing the weather. "Just remember, sunlight's a funny thing. It shines in both directions." I stared at the phone after the call ended. I didn't know whether to be angry or impressed. The next morning, I called my land surveyor to check on his progress, but he told me there'd been an issue with one of his GPS files, a corrupted dataset. I thought nothing of it until he mentioned that the intern who'd prepped the site for scanning was a guy named Derek. That name sounded familiar. Derek was the same person who'd shown up a few days earlier offering to help clear shoreline brush. I'd paid him cash for a couple days of cleanup work. I checked my cameras. Nothing suspicious, but that didn't mean much. The cameras had dead zones. I'd meant to fix that. I asked my attorney to dig into the public map the HOA had circulated. A few calls and one subpoena later, we confirmed it was a forgery. The image wasn't from a county archive. It had been printed on archival-style paper, artificially aged using lemon juice and a heat lamp, then scanned at low resolution to hide the lack of a stamp. The metadata on the digital file showed it had been created on a laptop registered to none other than Karen Walcott, president of Lakes Edge HOA. It wasn't a smoking gun. It was a fireworks factory. I compiled everything. The forgery, the harassment, the mailbox, the call, the surveillance gaps. Then I emailed the entire folder to my attorney under the subject line. These people don't know what kind of hydrologist they're dealing with. I wasn't backing down. Not because of pride, not because of spite, though by this point there was plenty of both, but because I knew what came next. When people start rewriting maps, it's never just about a pier. It started with a knock on the door and a man holding a clipboard dressed in the kind of neon orange vest that screams official to people who don't know how easy it is to buy one off Amazon. He had a company badge clipped to his collar that read Ozark Water and Utilities, Dam Safety Division. The name on the badge was Derek Langford, said he was doing routine inspections for small-scale flood risks. I wasn't in the mood for any more surprises, but the man played it smooth. Said my dam, and I use that word loosely since it was just a reinforced spillway from the original fish farm, might fall under state oversight if the lake exceeded certain size thresholds. I asked him to cite the statute. He said he'd have to look it up and quickly changed the subject to shoreline erosion. He walked the bank with me for 10 minutes, asking a few too many questions about runoff, water levels, and my GPS tagging. Then casually, he mentioned he did freelance work. Drone surveys, vegetation clearing, GIS mapping, and left a business card. I kept it but didn't call. I should have known. 3 days later, I left for Springfield. I had a meeting with an environmental lab and a sit-down with a contact at the Department of Natural Resources. I was gone for 48 hours. When I came back, the padlock on my shed was missing. Nothing was stolen, at least not obviously, but the inside looked off. My files had been shuffled. A stack of property documents that I kept in a weatherproof bin was upside down, and my backup flash drive was missing. At first, I thought I was being paranoid. Then I checked my trail cameras. One of the cameras had been physically turned away. Another, the one covering the main path to the shed, had the SD card removed. I hadn't done that. The battery logs showed it went offline for nearly 12 hours before rebooting. I made a report to the sheriff's office. The deputy who came out was polite but vague, like he'd already been briefed on how contentious the property line situation had become. He took my statement, looked around, and shrugged when I pointed out that nothing was taken. But things escalated quickly. Later that week, while I was clearing brush near the western edge, I saw a white utility truck idling near the edge of my property. No decals, no license plate visible. 2 men stepped out wearing safety gear. They ignored me completely and began walking down toward the lake, carrying what looked like water sampling kits. "Excuse me," I called. "You're on private land." One of them raised a hand like he was waving off a child. "We've got work orders." "Dam inspection." "There's no dam," I said. They kept walking. I dialed the local sheriff again, and this time, the response came faster. Within 15 minutes, 2 patrol cars pulled up. One of the officers recognized me from my previous complaint. He stopped the men and asked for identification. They hesitated. That was enough. Turns out the work orders they were carrying were fabricated, official-looking, laminated, and complete with a forged seal from the Missouri Department of Water Resources. But one of the deputies spotted the inconsistencies right away. The font wasn't standard, the paper type was wrong, and the seal had a slight blur. The kind of thing you only notice if you've seen a real one. They were detained on the spot. Later, when we dug deeper, it came out that their employer was a shell company, registered to a strip mall address in St. Louis, with no real operations. The registered agent, a paralegal who worked for Karen Walcott's husband's real estate firm. One of the detained men had a folder with my name on it, a list of properties bordering the lake, and an action plan that included phrases like recover hard docks, locate any backups, and, this one chilled me, secure shoreline entry point. Before fall, I called my lawyer. Then I called the local news. It wasn't about kayaking anymore. It wasn't even about the pier. Someone wanted control over my land badly enough to send fake inspectors to break into my property. The entire dam safety excuse was a pretext, a way to get legal access, or the appearance of it, to my shoreline. But why? That's when my surveyor finally connected a set of dots we hadn't considered before: the aquifer map. A decade ago, the Missouri Geological Survey conducted tests across Taney County to identify underground freshwater sources. According to their models, a high-capacity recharge zone ran directly beneath the lake, my lake, making it one of the most viable long-term water access points in the area. Lake's Edge HOA wasn't fighting for a pier. They were fighting for control of a potential municipal-grade water source. The pier, the kayaks, the heritage use argument, it was all camouflage for something far more lucrative: control the shoreline, control the tap. They'd tried maps, media, lawsuits, and now infiltration, and now I knew they weren't just trying to annoy me, they were staging a quiet little resource coup. I looked out over the water that night, the wind moving across the surface in long ripples. Somewhere beneath that calm, millions of gallons of opportunity slept undisturbed. And someone had decided they had more right to it than the man who'd signed the deed. They'd sent in scouts. Now it was time to fortify the castle. Courtrooms were never my battlefield of choice, but I've spent enough time on the edge of federal water disputes to know how bureaucracies operate when they think they're not being watched. They don't shout. They don't threaten. They wait you out. Slowly. Legally. And they're never alone. The first hearing was set in the Taney County Courthouse, a red brick relic of the 1950s with a metal detector that beeped at everyone except the people you hoped it would. The judge assigned to the case was Glenn Rickert. Gray suit, thin voice, polite to the point of condescension. I'd done my homework. Rickert had a reputation for balancing community interests, which was local code for never ruling against anyone who lived within golfing distance. Karen Walcott showed up with a full entourage: 3 lawyers, a publicist, and a man in an actual bow tie who introduced himself as a community heritage consultant. Her expression in the courtroom reminded me of someone arriving to collect a trophy, not defend a fraud. Their opening motion was a masterpiece of legal theater. They requested an injunction barring me from impeding traditional community access to the lake pending clarification of historical ownership. They cited oral testimonies, HOA meeting minutes, and, I shit you not, aerial photographs showing community usage patterns as early as 2006. My attorney, Paige Llewellyn, wasn't amused. They're asking for a restraining order against private property boundaries, she told me flatly. It's performance art. Still, Judge Rickert entertained it. He accepted their motion for review and, more alarmingly, denied ours to strike the fake map from evidence until its provenance could be fully examined. That was my first real taste of the game. Stall, delay, overwhelm. But Paige was smarter than she looked. She'd been poking through financial disclosures from the HOA and found something curious. The HOA's general fund, which was supposed to be designated for parking lot resurfacing and playground maintenance, had an unaccounted expense line labeled simply as Water Access Development, Phase 1. Nearly $22,000 had been rerouted over the course of 8 months. No bids, no invoices, just a paper trail that led to a shell company based out of Branson. When she dug further, she found the company had only one client on record, the Lake's Edge HOA. We brought that to court on the second day, and that's when the cracks started to show. The judge tried to brush it off as budgetary discretion, but Paige wouldn't let up. She motioned to compel a forensic audit of HOA expenditures, arguing that the community was funding an illegal land grab disguised as amenity improvement. The courtroom shifted. Karen's lawyers huddled. That same afternoon, a reporter from the Missouri Sentinel reached out to me. Apparently, someone had leaked the story. The headline ran the next morning: HOA funds used to build illegal dock. Property dispute heats up. The public reaction was immediate. Comments flooded in. Some residents of Lake's Edge started reaching out anonymously, admitting they didn't know where their dues were going, and that the pier had never even been voted on. Karen doubled down. Her lawyers filed an emergency brief requesting that the court prohibit me from sharing private community documents with the media. Paige countered with a First Amendment brief so sharp it could have cut paper. In the middle of all this, a quiet little subpoena landed on Paige's desk, sent from a different county under the radar. It was a request for any documentation related to water quality studies I'd conducted on the lake. The sender? a private consultancy that often partnered with the Regional Development Authority, the same one Lakes Edge HOA had previously pitched for potential infrastructure grants. They weren't just trying to take the lake. They were laying the foundation to turn it into a water source for resale, a local aquifer, privately accessed, publicly financed, controlled by the HOA or whatever corporate husk they planned to evolve into once the deed was overturned. We filed a motion to transfer the case to federal court under the Quiet Title Act, citing that the property transfer had originated through federal auction and involved federal water rights. Rickert pushed back, said jurisdiction was not clearly preemptive. That's judge speak, for I know this case doesn't belong here, but I don't want to give it up yet. Still, we had leverage now. We weren't just defending land. We were exposing a full-blown financial scheme, and more importantly, we had receipts. That week, I started seeing unmarked cars parked a little farther down the road from my property. The same white trucks, different faces, nothing overt. Just enough to be noticed, just enough to remind me they hadn't gone anywhere. Karen might have had the golf courses and the gala invites and Judge Rickert's Christmas card, but I had something better. Facts, paper trails, and a lawyer who didn't blink. She wanted a quiet handover. She was going to get a very loud trial instead. The subpoena hit like a hammer, not because it was unexpected, but because it confirmed exactly what I'd suspected since the first kayak hit my shoreline. The development firm tied to Lakes Edge HOA had submitted a grant proposal to the State Infrastructure Board 3 months before I even bought the lake. It was buried in a batch of funding requests under the title Community Aquifer Access and Resilience Enhancement. Catchy, sanitized, deceptive as hell, they weren't just after shoreline privileges. They wanted to build a full-scale pumping and filtration station, tie it into the county's secondary water grid, and lease access back to the municipality under a for-profit co-op model. The entire scheme hinged on one thing: access to the groundwater beneath my property. And since the only viable point of withdrawal was directly adjacent to the pier they had so lovingly built, everything suddenly made sense. The fake map, the legal noise, the public smear campaign. It was all theater. Expensive, coordinated, manipulative theater. I brought the file to Paige. She read through it twice without speaking, then leaned back in her chair and muttered. These people didn't just lie. They built a business plan on it. That same week, a package arrived at my property with no return address. Inside was a flash drive. No note, no label, just the word Karen written in Sharpie across the plastic casing. I checked it on an isolated laptop, one not connected to any network. The files were all voice memos and PDFs, internal emails, draft plans, financial forecasts. But the smoking gun, a series of recorded Zoom calls between Karen Walcott, her attorneys, and 2 board members casually discussing how to move him off the land before Q4. In one clip, Karen laughs and says, "He's just a contractor with a glorified fishing license. We'll bury him in paperwork and take the shoreline inch by inch." We filed the recordings under seal. Paige nearly burst out laughing in court when we presented the transcript during the pretrial evidentiary hearing. The judge didn't. Rickert's expression was pure discomfort, like he'd bitten into a lemon and didn't want to admit it. He didn't throw the case out, but he ruled that the recordings would be admissible in full if verified. That was the beginning of the end. Karen's team panicked. Their PR firm pulled the HOA's website offline within hours. Social media pages went dark. A week later, a whistleblower from inside the HOA, a young treasurer named Melissa Fields, reached out through our legal team. She'd resigned quietly and was willing to talk in exchange for limited immunity. What she gave us was gold. According to Melissa, the original idea for the pier came from a strategic planning retreat in which Karen and 2 board members discussed community-controlled utility assets. The pier was Phase 1. Phase 2 was a small utility shed. Phase 3, hidden behind legalese, was a water intake valve disguised as a monitoring station for water quality. The documents showed preliminary cost estimates, fundraising proposals, and, most damning of all, plans to leverage HOA dues to fund early construction without informing residents. Melissa handed over the internal ledger, raw email chains, and a draft agreement with the Branson Water Cooperative. It was all there: fraud, misappropriation of funds, conspiracy to commit regulatory evasion. We prepped a package for the Missouri State Attorney General and sent a copy to a journalist at the Missouri Sentinel, but the piece de resistance came 2 nights later. I was going over maps in my office when the doorbell rang. It was Hank Brenner. a retired cop who lived 2 properties over, usually the kind of man who waved from a distance and kept to himself. That night, he looked like he'd seen a ghost. "I just had a truck roll past my place, same one I've seen near your gate," he said. "Didn't look like meter readers." We pulled up footage from one of his driveway cameras. There it was. The same nondescript white pickup, slow rolling past my property. I sent it to Paige, who forwarded it to the sheriff. 2 days later, we got word. The men in the truck worked for Clearwell Logistics, a subcontractor with ties to multiple HOA utility projects across the county. A subpoena revealed that one of their contracts was signed not by a county official, but by Karen herself, in her capacity as president of Lakes Edge HOA. That sealed it. Now the state was paying attention. The AG's office opened a formal investigation: fraud, misuse of funds, impersonation of government officials, and potentially racketeering, depending on how deep the conspiracy went. I drove down to the pier the next morning. The lake was still. The surface glass smooth, as if it were waiting. I looked at the cheap aluminum plaque they'd bolted to the wood. Property of Lakes Edge HOA. I pried it off with a crowbar and tossed it into the bed of my truck. They'd come for the shoreline. I was about to come for the whole damn machine. By the time we reached the final hearing, the courthouse felt more like a film set than a legal venue. Reporters lingered outside in loose clusters. Camera crews buzzed around the main steps like gnats. Someone from a podcast I'd never heard of asked if I thought I was standing up for landowners everywhere. I told them I was just trying to keep people off my damn property. Inside, the courtroom was packed. Karen Walcott walked in with less confidence than usual, but still too much for someone under active investigation. Her attorney, a sweaty man with a hairline that had abandoned him mid-battle, tried to smile at me across the aisle. I didn't bother acknowledging him. Paige sat beside me, crisp as ever, flipping through exhibits like she was selecting ammo. We opened with a motion to dismiss the HOA's lawsuit in full, now supported by verified recordings, sworn statements from their own former treasurer, and a federal certification from the General Services Administration reaffirming that the property, every acre of water and land, had been transferred to me lawfully without any clerical error. Judge Rickert looked as if he'd aged a decade since the last hearing. Karen's team tried to pivot. They claimed the intent had never been malicious, that the HOA had acted in good faith to protect historical usage. Paige didn't flinch. She pulled up one of the recorded Zoom calls. On the big monitor, Karen's voice played loud and clear. "If we get that shoreline, the rest falls like dominoes. He won't have the resources to fight all fronts." Silence followed. Not even the publicist dared to clear their throat. We proceeded to show the entire email chain between Karen and the real estate development firm connected to the water infrastructure plan, then the Branson Water Cooperative pre-contract, then the Clearwell Logistics scouting logs, each one lined up like bullets in a magazine. Then came the punch. Paige called to the stand a representative from the Federal Land Disposition Authority, who calmly explained, with diagrams and official stamps, that not only had the lake been sold correctly, but the original federal ownership had never designated it as public or shared recreational land. Not in the 70s, not ever. The heritage plat map the HOA had relied on was a fabrication. And yes, it had been digitally aged using deliberate tampering. He brought a forensic analyst to confirm. At that point, Judge Rickert had 2 choices: pretend it was all still ambiguous, or cut his losses. He took a recess. When court resumed, his tone had changed. The old sleepy authority was gone. What remained was a man who saw a freight train labeled obstruction of justice heading straight for his bench. He ruled in my favor, fully, without qualifiers. The HOA's lawsuit was dismissed with prejudice, meaning it couldn't be refiled. He ordered them to pay my legal fees in full, plus restitution for property damage and emotional distress. But more importantly, he referred the matter to the county district attorney, citing serious and credible evidence of fraud, document falsification, and misuse of funds under color of legal authority. That courtroom didn't erupt. It exhaled. Karen's jaw didn't drop. It locked. I caught a glimpse of her hand shaking as she gathered her papers. Outside, the press descended. Paige handled most of it with her signature blend of calm and dagger-like precision. I gave one short statement. You can build a dock, but you can't build it on someone else's property and call it justice. The next 48 hours felt like the closing of a siege. 3 HOA board members resigned. 1. The treasurer, Melissa Fields' replacement, lawyered up immediately. A local resident started a petition to dissolve the HOA entirely, citing misuse of dues, lack of transparency, and attempted hostile seizure of private land. It gained over 70% of signatures in less than 2 days. Then the bomb dropped. The Missouri Attorney General's office announced a formal criminal investigation into Lakes Edge HOA and its executive board. Karen, her attorney, and 2 contractors from Clearwell were named in the statement. The charges: conspiracy to defraud, falsification of legal documents, and attempted unlawful conversion of state-certified private property. They were given 72 hours to turn themselves in. Karen didn't show up to the emergency HOA meeting that weekend. Neither did her lawyer, but I did. I wasn't invited. Didn't care. The residents sat in a circle on folding chairs in a community center that smelled like old tile and burnt coffee. Most of them looked exhausted, embarrassed, ashamed even. I walked to the center of the room, held up a printed copy of my property deed, and set it on the table in front of them. I suggest you read this next time someone says they speak for the community. No one argued. No one had the stomach left. 2 months later, the lake was quiet again. No more construction noise. No white trucks lurking at the tree line. No HOA newsletter stuffed into my mailbox pretending to be community poetry while plotting a hostile takeover. Just water, wind, and the occasional heron that had far more claim to the shoreline than anyone from Lake's Edge ever did. The pier was gone. County contractors had dismantled it after the court ruling, plank by plank. I watched from my porch as they loaded the last of it onto a flatbed. When one of them asked if I wanted to keep the sign, the one that read, Property of Lakes Edge HOA, I told him to toss it into the burn pile with the rest of the bad decisions. Karen Walcott was under house arrest pending trial. Her mugshot made the local paper twice. She'd gone from HOA queen to meme in less than a week. The caption under her photo said, Protecting the community from the law. Fitting. Lakes Edge held an emergency vote to dissolve the HOA. Over 80% of the residents voted yes. The rest were probably too embarrassed to show their faces. Melissa Fields, the whistleblower, took over as interim treasurer just long enough to audit the books and refer several more names to the state attorney's office. Turns out, fraud is like mold. Once it starts, it spreads. As for me, I filed a separate defamation lawsuit against the HOA's former PR firm and one of the newspapers that ran their hit piece. Settled out of court. Can't talk about the numbers, but I upgraded my boat motor, and I added something new at the shoreline. A large, clean sign. Black letters on steel, bolted to a post sunk 3 feet into the rocky ground. Private lake. Trespassers will be prosecuted. Ask the HOA how that went. Some folks still drive by, slow, hoping for a glimpse. Maybe to see the man who stood his ground. Maybe just to see if there's anything left to take. Either way, I don't wave. Not unless they bring bait. Every other Saturday now, I host a small fishing retreat for local veterans. Nothing fancy. Coffee. Gear, good stories, quiet water. Some of them just sit at the edge for hours without saying a word. I get it. Some things don't need to be explained, just respected. A grad student from Mizzou reached out recently. Wants to study the lake's recharge rate and its ecological integrity post-conflict. I told her she was welcome, as long as she brings her own waiters and doesn't mind the sarcasm. People ask if I regret buying this place. I don't. This wasn't just about property lines or paperwork. It was about principle, about the idea that something clearly yours shouldn't be stolen by committee, then called a misunderstanding. I don't guard the lake. I guard the idea that ownership still means something.